Tell us what it was like to work at a place like Bell Laboratories in the late 1960s.
Bell Laboratories, my working career there lasted 3 years, from roughly 67 to 70. And I was at what was known as the Homedale Laboratories. And we were essentially given by Mother Bell, AT&T, a pot full of money and asked to research and find out and answer certain kinds of general questions. And that's why the labs was able to invent the transistor and Telstar and all kinds of wonderful magical things, is that they weren't confined to just the telephone company. They were allowed to go into other areas. The area that I was allowed to go into, because of some of the work I'd done at Illinois Bell, was how do information systems get built. And a research of the literature at that time, presumably, would say surely by the late 70s, we knew how to, or late 60s, we knew how to build information systems, but we didn't. We were sort of guided in all the wrong directions by IBM, who was called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and that was RCA and Spectrum and the others. So what we would do is analogous to jacking up the hind end of your car and running it all night long, and coming out in the morning and looking at the speedometer and saying, hot dog, I got 784 miles on her last night. Well, all you really did was run it in the garage and use up gasoline. So all we really did with our IBM machines is make them calculate 24 hours a day. But we didn't know exactly what it was we were calculating, or how to use it, or what to do with it. Obviously, that was not the way to use information systems. And so my research said nobody had figured this out yet. Nobody. You would think that the great think tank houses, you would think that the guys who built the machines, you would think that some of the little tiny software houses that were starting to grow up, but everybody was concentrating on programming, 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 as if you kept the engine busy you were making money, and you were not. So it was a little shocking to find out that the person who knew and had written most about that at that point in time was System Command Headquarters, United States Air Force. I was not a big believer in the military, but in this instance, they were ahead of all industry. And they'd written some of these things down and given some notions that things were not right and that things ought to be in a different sequence, a different order and whatnot. I researched a little bit of that and found out that the guys who'd been allowed to do this with the Air Force had retired and were no longer with System Command. It was no longer even funded. So you could look at their literature, but you couldn't go any further. And they hadn't gotten into the payoff start area itself. How do you get it started right? But I tracked some of them down because I had Bell Labs money. I tracked down in particular Colonel John Gartner in San Antonio, Texas, retired. And he tracked down about 5 other guys. And I got contract money from Bell Labs and started them working on how do we figure out how this should be done. And all things said and done in the end, I was more fundamental to that effort than any of the research companies I worked with, because my paycheck somehow or other to me was attached to it. And what I figured out in the end is, it is very much analogous to building a building. You don't start by the fancy 10th floor in the restaurant and whatnot. You don't start even with the 3rd floor. You've got to start a big building with digging a hole in the ground in the wrong direction. Down. You've got to put down footings. And after you put down footings, you've got to build on those footings to come up at a certain rate and a certain level, and it's given. You can't just say, today we're going to work on the 27th floor. No, we're not up that far. And with information systems, you can't just say, today we're going to program. No, we haven't figured out who is the user. What are their needs? Enough of the lecture. So the Bell Labs gave me the most marvelous opportunity in the whole wide world to explore this emerging field of technology, to work with some of the brightest minds in the whole wide world, to have incredible freedom to pursue as fast and as hard as I possibly could in an environment that was just scrumptious for that kind of work, and other people at the laboratories who had kind of intellect. You just stand back and say, wow, isn't that person amazing? So Bell Labs was one wonderful place to work for 3 years. But at the end of 3 years, I could see that Bell Labs was going to come apart at the seams, partly because of its own faulty leadership, and partly because the Justice Department deemed it appropriate to break up the Bell system. So, as the end of my work there came about, John Wiley and Sons came to me and said, how about writing a book for us on what you have discovered and what your thoughts and ideas are? Well, I'm probably the last person in the world who ever thought they would write a book. But John Wiley said, we got a bunch of money here. How about we give you a little bit of it and get you started on this book? I accepted. This book came forth. And the first thing that this book did was not change the world. First thing this book did was provide the money to bring one Ma'ari from Korea to America. It's the best thing this book has done since then. And it put me on the international speaking circuit, and later bought me several trips to Italy. Did a good job.
Who's the book dedicated to?
Who is the book dedicated to? Right here on the dedication page. To my wife, Judy, and my children, Mark, Robin, and Maya.